72 hours. Adainim Susas and Indi, 120 square kilometers. And a defensive line that Russia spent 18 months engineering simply stopped holding. Not at the point of maximum assault, not where the Ukrainian armored push was heaviest. It stopped holding at the seam, the quiet section, the part of the line where the concrete was still standing, the minefields were still intact, and the soldiers inside the positions had run out of the things that make concrete and minefields mean something. Ammunition, communication, the certainty that someone behind them was coming. To understand what actually happened on that front, you have to stop looking at the map and start looking at what was happening 40, 60, 80 kilometers behind it. Because this battle was not decided in the 72 hours it took to cross that ground. It was decided in the 6 weeks before a single Ukrainian soldier moved. And the mechanism that produced the collapse was not firepower. It was patience. Systematic, deliberate, unglamorous patience applied to exactly the right targets in exactly the right sequence. Russia had built something genuinely serious along the Donetsk axis. Multiple defensive belts, anti-tank ditches, reinforced firing positions, overlapping minefields seated at depth. From an aerial photograph, it looked like a problem that would cost months and thousands of casualties to solve. Military analysts looking at satellite imagery in the weeks before the operation were not wrong to call it formidable. The physical infrastructure was real. The engineering effort was significant, and none of that is in dispute. But satellite imagery does not show the ammunition resupply vehicle that failed to arrive for the third consecutive week. It does not show the company commander trying to reach battalion on a radio net that keeps dropping out. It does not show the reserve platoon pulled from its holding position to plug a gap 4 kilometers south and never returned. It does not show the forward observation post that reported Ukrainian movement, waited 40 minutes for an artillery response, and when the shells finally came, they landed 400 meters off target because the gun crew was working from outdated coordinates. Those are the things that make a defensive line function, not the concrete, not the wire. The living, breathing, logistical, and human network behind the concrete and the wire. And on this section of the front, by the time Ukraine moved, that network was failing at multiple points simultaneously. The deep strike campaign that preceded the ground operation was not headline news. It did not produce dramatic footage. It did not generate the kind of imagery that dominates social media feeds. What it produced was methodical, cumulative degradation of the infrastructure feeding the forward positions. Rail transfer points handling ammunition resupply were struck. Fuel storage facilities in the operational rear were hit. At least 2 regimental-level command posts, according to available reporting, were targeted in the weeks prior. Individual strikes were not spectacular. Collectively, they were surgical, and their purpose was not to destroy the defensive line. Their purpose was to starve it slowly enough that the starvation would not trigger an immediate tactical response, but deeply enough that when the ground assault came, the system behind the line would not have the capacity to react coherently. By the time Ukrainian reconnaissance was completing its final targeting picture, forward Russian positions in the breakthrough sector were assessed to be operating at a significant fraction below their intended ammunition allocation. Personnel rotations had stretched beyond what tactical doctrine considers sustainable for maintaining combat readiness. Battalion-level communications, the kind required to mass fires and move reserves in coordinated response to an assault, had been degraded to the point of intermittency. The forward positions were still occupied, the weapons were still in place, but the system connecting those positions into a coherent defensive network had been quietly coming apart for weeks. The fortifications were still there. The fighting power sustaining them was running on fumes. Now picture what the first hours of the ground operation actually looked like at the level of a single position. Pre-dawn, a prepared concrete emplacement somewhere in the breakthrough sector. A small crew, a crew-served weapon. A radio, the kind of position that in a fully functional defensive system is genuinely dangerous. It has prepared fields of fire. It has overhead cover. It is integrated, in theory, into a network of adjacent positions providing mutual support, capable of calling for artillery when one node comes under pressure, designed to hold long enough for reserves to arrive and restore the line. On paper, it is exactly what a defensive position should be. Ukrainian units approach through the low ground. Contact. The position opens fire, and the soldier inside reaches for the radio to report the contact and call for supporting fires. He gets through. He reports. He waits. The artillery does not come in the first 5 minutes. He continues engaging. The adjacent position to his north is dealing with its own contact and cannot shift fires to support him. The battalion command post that is supposed to be coordinating the response is simultaneously receiving contact reports from 4 other points across the sector, working from a communications architecture that keeps cycling in and out, trying to build a coherent enough picture to know where to commit the reserve without leaving another section of the line uncovered. The reserve element itself is fueled and positioned. Its soldiers are ready. But the order to move has not come because the command post has not yet resolved the picture. 5 minutes becomes 10. 10 becomes 20. The position is still fighting, but it is fighting alone, and the soldiers inside it know it. Here is what no fortification manual captures, and no thickness of concrete can solve. A trench is not a defensive system. A trench is only a promise that the system behind it will arrive in time. The emplacement, the overhead cover, the prepared fields of fire, these are not the defense. They are the visible surface of a promise. And when that promise breaks, the position does not become weaker gradually. It becomes a trap, a well-constructed, carefully positioned trap for the people inside it. That is the moment, not the moment of physical defeat, the moment of rational fracture. The soldier in the emplacement stops calculating how to hold the position and starts calculating whether holding it is still a rational choice. The artillery has not fired. The reserve has not moved. The adjacent position is fully committed to its own fight. The support structure that justified staying, that made holding tactically logical, has not performed. And the forward soldier, who has no visibility into why the system has failed him, has no way of knowing if it ever will. That calculation, running simultaneously through the minds of soldiers across dozens of positions along the breakthrough sector, is how a defensive line dissolves faster than any frontal assault could account for. Not through cowardice, not through individual failure, through the entirely rational conclusion that the system they were part of had already ceased to function. Once forward positions begin pulling back without orders, without a coordinated fighting withdrawal that preserves unit integrity, the collapse feeds itself. Adjacent positions suddenly carry exposed flanks. The minefields that were supposed to channel attacking formations into prepared kill zones are bypassed because the positions covering those kill zones are no longer occupied. The anti-tank ditches that were engineered to stop armored vehicles become obstacles that slow the Ukrainian advance by minutes rather than hours because there is no longer a coherent fire network positioned to exploit the delay they create. The defensive architecture, absent the human system that gave it meaning, begins working against the defenders. Every obstacle becomes a landmark for the attacker. Every prepared position becomes a potential encirclement risk for whoever stays inside it. 120 square kilometers in 72 hours. Not because Ukraine had more soldiers, not because the Russian fortifications were poorly designed, because the assault was timed, shaped, and directed to strike at the exact point where the degradation had gone deepest, at the precise moment when the system behind the line had crossed from degraded to functionally broken. Now step back from the position level and look at what this operation exposes about Russian command culture on this axis. The Russian military concentrates decision authority at levels too high for the tempo of modern tactical engagements. A battalion commander who requires permission from regiment before committing his reserve is not a commander who can respond to a fast-moving breakthrough. He is a reporting node waiting for authorization while the tactical window closes in real time. The process designed to ensure coordinated action produces delay instead. And in a defensive engagement against a force moving at speed with initiative, delay is not a setback. Delay is the defeat itself. This is not an individual failure. It is institutional. It is embedded in the training pipeline, in the doctrine, in the deeply ingrained expectation of how Russian officers at the tactical level are supposed to behave. The commander who waits for orders before acting is not failing his unit. He is performing exactly as the system shaped him to perform. The system is what failed, and the system fails in the same way, at the same point in the decision cycle, every time it faces an opponent moving faster than its authorization process can accommodate. Ukraine, by contrast, has spent 3 years of active war developing something that cannot be purchased, cannot be imported, and cannot be rushed into existence. A tactical decision-making culture built on hard experience. The willingness of small unit leaders to read the developing situation, assess the intent behind their orders rather than the letter of them, make the call, and move without waiting for a command post that frequently has no better picture of the ground than they do. That cultural gap does not appear on any order of battle. It does not show up in an equipment comparison or a personnel count. But in the first 6 hours of a breakthrough operation, when positions are falling and communications are fragmenting and the reserve is waiting for an order that is not coming, it determines everything. What makes this operation worth studying carefully is not the scale of the territorial gain. Territory changes hands. What makes it significant is the degree to which Ukraine demonstrated a coherent operational methodology, not just tactical aggression. Assess where the Russian system is most degraded. Apply deep strike pressure to accelerate that degradation in specific targeted ways. Time the ground assault to the moment of maximum systemic stress. Move faster than the Russian command cycle can generate an organized response. The individual elements of this approach are not new to military theory. The disciplined, integrated execution of all of them in sequence against a prepared defense is the achievement. Russia built a defensive architecture explicitly designed to compensate for its institutional vulnerabilities. The layered belts, the redundant obstacles, the depth, all of it was meant to buy time for a command culture that moves slowly to catch up with a battlefield that moves fast. Ukraine identified that compensatory logic, targeted the logistics and command infrastructure that made it function, and stripped the architecture of its compensating value before the assault began. The line did not break because Ukraine was stronger. The line broke because Russia could no longer keep the promise its own trenches were making to the soldiers inside them. And that is the lesson that will outlast the specific terrain, the specific units, and the specific 72 hours. When a defensive system can no longer keep that promise, it does not matter how deep the ditches are, how thick the concrete is, or how many months it took to construct. It is no longer a defensive system. It is a series of positions waiting to be bypassed by an enemy that understood, long before the assault began, that the real target was never the line. The real target was the promise.